One word I would use to describe Jabe is charismatic.
Determined.
Friend.
Personal.
Outgoing.
Inviting.
One word I would use to describe Naj is blessing.
Big-hearted.
Anointed.
Legendary.
Defender.
Passionate.
What you just saw was a few students that came together to honor Naj and Jabe, the students that passed away last semester. We want to continue to honor them as we reflect on their beautiful lives.
And as we prepared for this episode, we knew that grief is, of course, a huge part of loss and death. And as we prepared, we also realized that loss encompasses more of life than just death. And so we have with us today Lena Barber, and we are so thankful you are here. She is a teacher at Lee, a counselor in the Counseling Center. You also lead a grief group here on campus. And so thank you for having the conversation of grief with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. I love it.
As we have this conversation, we hope that you listen with an open heart and open mind, and just let's dive in. So Lena, our first question for you is, how is grief important in the healing process?
Grief is to be respected for sure. If we don't respect grief and give it a space in our loss, then it has a way of ambushing us when we least expect it. And so we have no control over the ambush for sure, but it could be something like hearing a song that makes us think about somebody that we've lost, or it could be that we see something that makes us think about somebody that we've lost, and we reach for it, or we want to call that person, and we realize all of a sudden they're not there. They're not there to receive the communication we want to give them. And so if we don't take the time to grieve, and I'll tell you, we are people of pattern, right? We like our patterns. We get up and do the same things every morning, whatever you do first. We love structure, and when our structure is disheveled from loss, we have to pay attention to it and readjust. And grief helps us in that process.
And so why is grieving so hard for us to do as humans?
That's a good question. Think about it. From as long as we can remember, as a child, we have been programmed to and we avoid loss at all costs, right? So you get a good education, to get a good job, and remember the first time we lost something. It could have been a pet, it could have been anything like that, but our parents or whoever gave us care at the time ran to our defense and sheltered us from the look of what just happened from the loss. They gave us very little information. And so we've learned to avoid loss. And so it's very important for us to realize the myths that we have learned early on and rewrite those in a way that is healthy.
As we look closer at grief, does grief look different for every loss?
Sure does. This is the thing about grief. You know, we've heard of Kubler-Ross, and she has stages of grief. She wrote that for people that were in death and dying, so they had just gotten bad news that they had cancer. And so these were the stages that she used for that. We tend to want to take those stages because we want a formula, right? Give me the rules. We're so rule-oriented. And so tell me what I'm supposed to do first. And we think denial. I remember a friend of mine, a widow had come to him, and of course she was interested in him, but when his wife died, she said to him with her casserole, bringing her casserole in, she said, "You must go through the stages of grief." And she talked to him about anger. He said, "I'm not angry." Yes, you must go through anger before you can get to the next one. So people think that there's a pattern to it. We all grieve uniquely. And so in giving care to someone that has lost somebody, it's very important to realize that They may not cry like you do.
Mm-hmm.
They may cry like you don't. They may want to talk about it right then. They may just want you to be in their company. And so you never know. And a good listener takes those cues
Yeah.
and doesn't try to fix, because there are no perfect words you can say to someone after they've lost someone that will relieve or alleviate the grief. The grief has to have a portion of its own. It has to show up somehow.
I feel like a lot of people kind of want to say the perfect thing at the perfect time, and it's like, no, your presence and you being there.
Absolutely.
And I know you told a story of someone just dropped food right at your front door and didn't say anything, just left that. And for you, that was someone being there for you when
Yeah.
you needed it.
The hardest thing for me to answer was, how are you?
Mm-hmm.
I never thought about it before, but I thought, I don't know how I am right at this minute. I'm numb. A second from now, I could be crying. So how are you? Those words took a life of their own. Also, it mattered who was asking me.
Mm-hmm.
But you have those people that are just curious and want information so they can pass it on, because information is power. And then you have those that you know are authentic and really care. And it doesn't matter if the people you know that are care and that care and are there for you, they can bundle it up and you don't care, because their love is, it's been there all along. It's hard to jump on someone's journey if you don't know them before. Somebody asked me to counsel with a friend of theirs, and I said, do they want that, or do you want that for them?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to be invited to a grief journey. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And some people try to bulldoze in, and it's not the thing to do.
Wow, that's really good. Authenticity can sometimes mean the world. So what is something that us Lee students should know about grief that we might not be aware of?
So much. I want all of you to take my class in the summer.
I want to take it.
I only teach it in June, and it's because I want to see it's so extensive. I want to see somebody every single day for 2 hours. I don't teach it during the semester because I don't want 3 days between the time, or 2 days between the time we meet again. And so we hit it hard and heavy for 4 weeks. What I would want you to know is you're unique. There are no rules. Listen to your grief. There are times when you need to be alone in your grief, but do not pull yourself away from others. You also need community. Community is really important, because you don't want to bear this alone. You can't. And that's not a time to isolate.
Right.
We need each other. And I love, somebody asked me the other day, what are the books that you recommend? And I had to go back and say, I recommend the Bible too, because you know the verse that says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. And the things that stand out to me are fear. I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. You are with me. So God never meant for us to walk that alone. There are times when there are things that we cannot share with anyone that are close to us, you know, especially if we want to protect the person who died.
Right.
There are private things that you'll always hold close. But community is so important in the fact that I'm not carrying this burden alone. There are people who love me and support me in prayer. And the fear part of that is, look at the losses that you've had. This is what happens. It takes away the fear. So when you process with someone, you can talk about those fears that you have that are associated to loss. And the shadow in the valley of death doesn't look so dark, because we're not carrying this alone. We're able to communicate it. And I think, Lee students, I love the fact that you can differ with someone politically or otherwise, because you get scripture and you can get 5 faculty members in the SOR to give 5 different views. I think we need to hear each other's perception after they have read the same scripture. There's so much sharing in that. It enriches us. Working with grief, I have evolved so much to what I believed 5 years ago, and it's because of other people that I've processed it with. And so I've learned along the way. And I think that when we don't condemn and we don't judge another, because judgment only comes from God, He does it righteously, we do it so unrighteously. But when we listen, and listening is listening, hearing the other person without trying to compete and say, oh, but I've got a better story than that. Listening and sitting in the moment and gathering information is so important. And I think this is probably the process of grief. I think that is more important than anything. Getting around telling stories. I loved hearing stories about these young men that we lost. I loved hearing personal accounts. They were bigger than life.
Absolutely.
And none of us are promised tomorrow. And what they've given us is that reminder to make sure that we tell people we love them today, that we are with, and do it unashamedly. That's the message I'd love to give to these students. Now, tell people you love them. Be proud of it. Don't be ashamed of that.
So good.
Taking it all in.
Yeah.
So as we just talk a little bit more about community, how do we grieve as a Lead community? You may have already touched on this, but just give us a little more on how.
Okay. As a community, I love hearing stories. I told you that, but journaling is huge. There are going to be times, I tell you what I do, and there have been so many losses with COVID and natural losses that we've seen with our students. When I wake up in the middle of the night, it is the loneliest feeling, and that's when all of those feelings come, right? We feel so isolated and alone. That's when I start praying that, Lord, please let his mother and father be sleeping and resting now, because that's the only reprieve we have from grief. God, please. And I start calling people's names out that have just heard that they have cancer and they're going through an incurable cancer. God, please allow them to be sleeping right now. Give them rest in their body that their body and soul needs, because that is the only reprieve we have from grief. And I think those things are so important. Reaching out to each other, holding each other up, letting you know that you're not carrying this alone. Telling stories, laughing through your tears. Of course, we miss them, but what an amazing mark they made on our life.